Thank you, Judy. That such a warm welcome makes me feel like such a fraud. But I know I am, as many of you are, so lucky to be at the Radcliffe this year, and I thank Dean Liz Cohen, Judy, and the sort of the smartness of the reviewers in getting us all here. But I recognize it to be an academic idyll, which most of the universities that we come from are no longer. And so I want to talk about neoliberalism to some extent and how wonder works within neoliberal worlds. As you heard, many of you heard in my introductory story last week, I spoke about how I started the origin story for this work when I literally stumbled over 4 priests trying to physically push a cow into a mirrored luxury elevator. And I wondered why. And I was told that the ritual would be wonderful, which it was. And so I stumbled serendipitously into this project of thinking about wonder. And as Judy said, it's taken me an enormously long time, 16 years. But it grew out of 2 very simple questions. The first one was scholarly, and the second one was personal. And we'll start with the scholarly. Can anyone tell the encompassing story of a radically diverse, ancient society like India that's pushed into the modern moment through recording fragments of sort of creative enterprise? And can one design a good life? Personal question. Can one design or create a good life in a neoliberal context? And the 2 questions might seem divergent, and indeed I started out with them very divergent, but they've come to a focus, and I hope I'll elucidate this focus as I go forward. When I speak of neoliberalism, I'm using it in the simplest sense, how what Jean and John Komaroff here at Harvard call millennial capitalism and the radical sort of uncertainty and precarity it brings to our lives. So I turned to my hometown of Bangalore for answers. And Bangalore is acknowledged to be, as Judy told you, the Silicon Valley of Asia. It is the center for biotech, for information technology. It is the center for innovation. And at one point in 2007, it was supposed to be the fastest growing city in Asia. And to just give you a sense, in 1990, when I left to go to school, I think of it as a town. Forgive me. It was 2.9 million people. I went to Denmark to speak, and they reared back when I said a town of 2.9 million people. But in 2010, the latest census we had an estimate of 9.2. And that is just an estimate of families that were counted. There are many people living in precarious slum circumstances that are not counted in the census. So you can see the radical shift in 20 years. Yeah? I'm going to come back to Socrates in a minute. So that's typical Bangalore. And as you can see, it's centrally located in the subcontinent of India. It's an exciting cosmopolitan city. It's a hub of disruptive innovation, of creativity, of building and patenting new technologies. There are 500 Fortune 500 companies there, largely software-based companies, IT companies, biotech companies. It's supposedly known for curating new ideas, objects. People think of it as an icon of smokeless kind of growth. So I thought, surely the bourgeoisie of Bangalore would be able to tell me something about a good life and how to live it, right? Surely they grasped at what a good life would be. That's one of the at the top of this building is the fanciest bar in Bangalore, and the cover charge is $700. That's before you start drinking. In 17 short years that I began the study in February 1998. And in the 17 short years since then, neoliberal policies have affected the city spectacularly, and increasing growth, as I mentioned. It moved from being a safe green city that I grew up in into a city where water shortages, rolling blackouts, extreme poverty and inequality, cutting of the green cover, desertification, all that was happening simultaneously as I was doing the study. So the anthropological, this was one of the main streets in 1967, I believe, and this is the same street today. So the anthropological proposition that follows is very simple. It's modest, it's in 3 parts. And in this talk, I'm going to take a slice of a larger question, and I'm going to deal with technology here. But the larger anthropological proposition about wonder is as follows. Can we try to sort of make it visible? Can we the ineffability of wonder? Can we think of an invitation to wonder as a strategic yet passionate act that can be hosted, built, captured, and stoked? And can we explore this sort of experimental ethos within which wonder is created? And can we think about creativity differently? And what are the ethics of a creative contingent act? So I'm going to try and sort of work my way around these. I probably won't get to all of them, but let's see how far I get. And I would really, really encourage you to push me on all this because I am struggling my way through it. Thinking through it. So what I'm aiming to do is to construct what I see as a very urgently needed sort of conceptual framework to understand contemporary religious practice in the margins of what we consider technically religion and ethical life. In academia, I've tried to bust my way into philosophy departments, into religious studies departments, and India and Hinduism. There have been questions about what kind of religion is it? Is it so practice-based? Its theologies, and so it raises very interesting questions as to what is a religion in the first place. Okay, so this is the neighborhood I studied. It's in the north of the city. It's called Malleshwaram, but you don't have to remember that. And it was carved out of virgin forest. And as you can see on the Google Maps page, it's known for its temples, right? The first thing that pops up is the temples. And so if you get closer now, these are the 2 temples I studied. Google Maps, they're within like half a mile of one another, and Google Maps happily, the symbol for a temple is the Om. So I began to study ritual in 2 Hindu temples in this neighborhood. And I divided it carefully between the 2 large Hindu sects: Vaishnavism, those who worship Vishnu, and Shaivism, those who worship Shiva. So this is the Ganesha temple for those who worship Shiva, and this is the deity, and he's dressed in tropical fruit on that day. Guavas, pineapples are all sliced, and the image is made out of fruit. And somebody yesterday, when I showed them the slide, said, "Wow, think of the number of fruit flies." Yes, there are plenty of flies. And Ganesha is the elephant-faced god who protects. And then we have Vishnu in the form of the flute cowherd, and he is the sort of redemptive blue-faced god. So I decided to study ritual in these two temples. And I can hear you think, why ritual? And let me explain why. Quite simply put, ritual is the counterintuitive case to creativity. Let me explain that. Ritual is always thought by anthropologists and others who study ritual to be the antithesis of change. It is where we go for tradition, for stability, for continuity. Gregory Bateson, Clifford Geertz, Catherine Bell have talked about this repeatedly. So any changes in ritual have been classified, any creativity, I would argue, have been misdiagnosed as a disruption, and I'm quoting, a mistake, a flaw, a distortion, an error, or a failure. So sites of creativity that anthropologists typically study, and I I'm not going to go into all the anthropologists, but I'm looking at South Asia particularly. Anand Pandyan studies cinema, Kiran Narayan studies songs, Tim Ingold doesn't study South Asia, studies Britain, but studies drawing and painting. And these are the classical sites, artistic sites that we think of as sites of creativity. But I want to argue that ritual is creative too. And this comes out of my dissertation defense at Harvard, because I started talking about these disruptions and failures, and a very famous professor, who shall remain nameless, said to me, but we know these guys are creative. That's nothing new. And I thought, really? I've never read that. So then I thought, if we know it, why isn't it written down? So I started thinking about my own education, and there's a famous essay by a very famous anthropologist, Clifford Geertz. The specialist audience will know where I'm going with this, but hey, I'll continue. All anthropologists read this in graduate school if they don't read it as an undergrad. And it's about the funeral of a young boy in Java, Indonesia. And what happens is, I'm going to paraphrase and bastardize, but anyway, what happens is this young boy dies unexpectedly when he's living at his uncle's house. And his uncle happens to have a new religious, secular, political identity. The priest comes over and says, well, I can't do this funeral because you are not a Bangan. You're not of the traditional type. The uncle gets infuriated and says, look, this child has just died. You need to do something. So the entire village is thrown into sort of a moment of conflict. And so Geertz talks about this conflict, talks about this funeral. And he notes that in funerals in Java are meant to be, as he says, a languid letting go. But here the residents show a froth of unusual emotion, I'm quoting, screaming and crying, thinking and arguing, sulking and storming away. And meanwhile, the body of the boy simmers in the sunshine. Geertz's focus on the fear and confusion of the villagers, the stalling and the questioning, pulls us back into that concept of social structure, that rituals elevate us to a moment that defies social structure, and then we are brought back into social structure in an enhanced, elevated state, right? But one can, I argue, read this text very differently. Because what happens in the end of the story is that, in point of fact, the parents of the boy travel to the uncle's house and they find a way out. They actually improvise something that works. So why don't we read it as a case study of the initial origin of creativity rather than failure of ritual? That would point to a very different direction, right? So unlike contemporary theorists who then begin with social structure and ask what ritual does, its efficacy, its abilities, its domestication of strange forces, etc., if we take Geertz's moment as a moment of creativity, we then ask, what is ritual? Very different question. And I want to ask this simple question. What is it? How does it allow for contingency? How does it allow for a radical revisionist reading? How this vision uncoils surreptitiously? It draws together modernity and religion. And here I focus on a very small snippet, as I said, a snippet of a snippet, and I'm going to talk about technology because technology is, to many people, enchanted in the first place. I'm going to drag you, unfortunately, I hope not kicking and screaming, but I'm going to drag you through a little bit of theory before I get to the fascinating stories I encountered. So Jonathan Z. Smith suggests that ritual is a particular mode of paying attention. It's a way of attending more closely to our habitus, and it is about the doing of religion. And let me show you 3 slides in quick succession. The first one was taken in 1999, and it is the same procession taken over 12 years. So here the Lord Krishna is taken out in an evening procession. The scent of his jasmine garlands, there's drumming, and the white umbrellas of sacred kingship, right? This is 6 years later. You can see electric light has intruded. You can see they're doing it in the evening. The God seems to almost fade away in the way the lights are positioned. And there's a video light. That's what makes it so bright. And this was in 2009. And you can see that technology now changes the devotee's relationship to the God. You collect pictures of the God, they're on your phone, versus the face-to-face darshan that Diana Eck has talked so beautifully about. So if we think about it as a mode of paying attention, what does technology do to this mode of paying attention? Philip Fisher, more beautifully Stephen Greenblatt, tells us that if we think about wonder, it is sort of visuality that motivates us, the visual, and that has an enchantment all its own. Here, visual experimentation consciously opposes ritual creativity. I will get back to that. And ritual creativity here is a crucial means of engaging contingency. So improvisation becomes the core around which creativity is generated. Yeah, this was at in Bangalore. So Bangalore is very big on creativity. And as an aside, when I was writing this talk last week, and I was in a hospital. It'll become clear why I was in this talk. And I started watching the TV news, and it's astounding how frequently creativity, wonder, curiosity keep repeating. You look at, and I was watching the news, so this was Viagra, this was car commercials, this was GE, that's what they were talking about. So creativity is endemic, as we understand it in the modern world, to new technologies and new ways of being. Now, it's not that anthropologists have not talked about wonder. Margaret Mead, the mother of anthropology, talked about wonder very early on. And she says, anthropology demands an open-mindedness with which one must look and listen, record in astonishment, wonder at that which one would not have been able to guess. So wonder for Mead is a bewilderment at the engagement of the other, with a capital O. So it seems to me, we don't hear of wonder after Margaret Mead. Anthropologists have been strangely silent on wonder, and my question was why, right? So I think that an ethnography of wonder is both timely and urgent. Why this urgency, you ask? And let me simply put it, that when we try to imagine new worlds, and I think this will speak to what the Radcliffe does. When we try to imagine new worlds and we build upon them, or we build them, we open up creative what-if possibilities. That is what we're attempting to do. And these what-ifs are the center of all inquiry. When we dream of a world that we cannot imagine today, and it is the goal to building new economies, new technologies, new ways of being, new resistances, new imaginings, new revolutions, etc. And so we come back to Socrates, where wisdom begins in wonder. So there's a difference here, of course, between wonderment and wondering, and I'm playing with those two. Okay, so the Oxford English Dictionary, I know I'm talking about the Oxford English Dictionary, and you have one of the temples here, but I like the sort of disturbance. The Oxford English Dictionary defines wonder as an emotion excited by the perception of something novel, something unexpected. It extends it to astonishment, perplexity, bewilderment. And in the Greek thaumatizon, the sudden descent of wonder implies that you are passive and you are wonder-struck, struck by wonder. But how passive are we? An essential definition brings to the forefront how little we actually know about wonder. We see it as a passive condition that we receive. Its extraordinariness, its suddenness, its seemingly divine rupturing into the mundane. So the mundane is set in opposition to wonderment. In the 18th and 19th centuries, if one looks at the Western intellectual history of wonder, Dalston and Park have done excellent work on this, on science, and how wonder breeds curiosity, it breeds collection, as in the wonder cameras, and you get Galvani and Boyle, the natural philosophers, talking about the sort of everything from the human body to the crumbling edges of the universe. I know if Demetrius is here, he would say they are not crumbling, but it's a childlike amazement that fuels us to ask. And Philip Fisher has said that wonder is a sudden experience of an extraordinary object that produces delight. Okay? We'll hold that thought. But I bring it into the 20th century, and I started looking at who writes about wonder in the 20th century. And there is this strange German scholar, forgive me, Bob Orsi, this strange German scholar, Rudolf Otto, who writes this beautiful book, The Idea of the Holy, Das Heilige, in which he talks about the feeling of the numinous. And this feeling of the numinous is essentially a feeling of wonderment. And let me say, and I'm quoting Greg Ellis, who has written this book on Otto. For Alice, Otto's numinous encompasses, and I say it in alphabetical order, awe, bewilderment, curiosity, confusion, excitement, ecstasy, fear, dread, marvel, mystery, perplexity, reverence, surprise, and supplication. So it includes not only the psychological effects of receiving wonder, but as human beings perceive it, of placing that wonder squarely back on the other as the numinous of the divine. So we feel it and we ascribe it to divinity. Okay. Strangely, the Upanishads say the same thing, and they were 2,500 years before, right? This, by the way, I couldn't resist this. This is a decoration made of American corn 2 weeks ago for the Ganesha festival. A chandelier of corn seemed particularly wondrous, of American corn. America has, I won't use the word dumped, but pushed a lot of its corn, as many of you know, to different economies, and this is the way the priests in Bangalore use it. This is the essential Hindu moment of looking at the god and having the god look back at you to recognize you, right? Offering of the camphor flame, the priest and his two sons. And the devotion to the deity. This is me, and this is my back. Okay. This is my back doing field work. I'm wondrous, and I'm wondering, and I'm bewildered, and I'm perplexed, and I keep asking them repeatedly questions. And I liked it because the priests are explaining something to me, and there's the processional god in the foreground, and the god looking at me from inside the alcove. And this is the priest who was a sort of philosopher, an extempore philosopher. He taught me everything I know. And I told him at the end of 15 years, I am so grateful that you are the priest because I could never be one. And he said, yes, you're a woman. You couldn't be one anyway. But if you were a man, you would have made a very good priest. I'll take that. Okay, so the Upanishads, to go back to my story, the Upanishads 2,500 years ago talk about wonder. And they talk about wonder in a fascinating way. And I take this excerpt from the Taittiriya Upanishad, which Kiran Narayan brought to my notice. And I've put the words that are important in red. Havu, havu, havu. We have no essential translation of this, but it has been translated by the mystical philosopher J. Krishnamurti as, oh wonderful, oh wonderful, oh wonder. Aham annam, I am the food. Aham annam, annam aham. I am the food, I am the food, I am the eater of the food. The story behind this is of a saint who suddenly realizes in a moment of self-transformation the oneness of the universe. And he realizes he is not only the eater, he is the food. He is made up of universal, the tyranny and beauty of universality comes through to him. And I put it up in Sanskrit because the long ahs that are part of the text they're called dirghas. They are essentially stating ecstasy. He's in an ecstatic moment of wonderment. So wonder haunts this text from 2,500 years ago. And from this text, we understand it's a point of convergence. He says, Suvarna Jyoti, I am effulgent, I am radiant with wonder, right? It's a point of convergence, not only of technologies of information, of knowledge, self-knowledge and other knowledge, but of the soul. So technologies of information, technologies of the soul, right? Bear with me. So back to the temples in Bangalore, and to the first story, which I called the Animatronic Devi. In October of every year, the Hindu festival of Navaratri, of 9 nights, devoted to the female principle occurs. And I'm quoting verbatim from my field notes here. And the female principal in this particular 9 nights engages in a battle. So it's basically consciousness over ego. The deity representing consciousness and the demon, the battle between the Devi and the demon represents the ego. The beautiful Devi of higher consciousness is trying to defeat Mahisha, the demonic ego. He is aided by the lesser demons of fear, anger, greed, and lust. And when he tries to grab her, and you can see an ancient, the sort of demon with a buffalo head, she's astride on a lion, she's trying to draw her bow. That's a more popular representation of the demon. This is an really ancient sculpture. Okay, so I think of the rape of Europa, very similar. So Mahisha ego tries to grab the goddess. And when he tries to capture her, she's instantly weaponized. Fangs develop in her howling mouth. Her arms sprout innumerable weapons: the sword of discrimination, the bow of determination, the bludgeon of psychic practice, all with the ultimate nuclear payload of powerful mantras. She roars like the lion she sits upon. Don't mess with her. So in October 1998, there she is again, Kashi, the head priest of the Ganesha temple, told me of this Navaratri myth. In his telling, the buffalo demon is a master of disguise, morphing instantly from one form to another, shape-shifting as the ego is wont to do. But the Devi recognizes him regardless of what shape he takes. She pours forth millions of goddesses from herself: the goddess of prudently applied intelligence, the goddess of wisely used material resources, and finally, Parvati, the goddess of creation, comes forth. As she does so, the goddess pierces the demon's buffalo head with a trident, and she decapitates him. Here, Kashi got very excited. He swung his arm to show what the goddess does. And he said he wanted to do an alankara, a decoration of the deity, the female deity, to show this power. For a week before the festival, Kashi mysteriously worked on a mechanical apparatus, which he kept covered with an oilcloth in the lower courtyard. I knew he had enlisted the help of a couple of IT engineers who came regularly to the temple. On days he looked tired, defeated, and he told me, "I have failed in English," as though he had taken an exam. But he never said what the alankara would be. Finally, the day for the puja arrived. Kashi disappeared into the sanctum, hidden by a curtain. Several thudding, mysterious sounds followed. With a flourish, the curtain was pulled back, and the goddess was revealed. She had one arm raised at an alarming height, and in it she clutched a shining tin-foil trident. At the goddess's feet was a papier-mâché buffalo with a severed head which ran red ink. I want you to picture the kitschiness of this. As we watched the spectacle transfixed, light bulbs in the sanctum flared and flashed, and the right arm of the deity came down with a rolling thud like a garage door. The trident striking the buffalo's body. Collectively, the assembled devotees let out a long ah of astonishment and appreciation. Their eyes were wide open and they hissed, the indrawn hiss of, of suddenness. They were wonderstruck. For the next 9 days, every 10 minutes, the deity's hand would come down with the sound of a garage door, and every time I noticed that the devotees were thrilled. The children would applaud, people would scream with delight. Michael Jackson, also here at Harvard, in his brilliant phenomenological study of the human-tech interface, talks about this interface as having existential issues, right? Human-machine relations are where our fate and destiny collide. They are both implicated. Indeed, in Bangalore, these existential questions are rife, but they are ethical and theological questions as well. I think that for a city built on tech innovation, a reflection on the connections between worship and technology may help us reframe our most implicit taxonomies of matter and spirit in intellectually freeing ways. What is compelling for me is the image of the engagement, even a union between divinity and technology. A merging of ways of being. It's not the typical subject-object split that we think of, but an object-other split, a cosmological split, where the material and the technological become an apparatus in creating belief. A new Heideggerian mode of knowing is created. So this reforging, this resonance of fusing the deity and the robot allow for chains of equivalence to occur, of simultaneous existence and annihilation, changing not only the meaning of the technology, but the biometrics of the deity itself, right? Here, ritual, as Eliade noted, makes creation again through an ethos of improvisation and experimentation. Michael Pewitt, I don't know if he's here, but he has written this amazing set of texts on ancient Chinese ritual. And he asked the central question, how can we create anew? And this question I have followed as the central sort of mantra in attempting to parse the other two examples. So, priests like Kashi engage technological apparati and the ethos of newness as an instrument and an agent of religious change and transformation. They allow an imagined world full of potential, full of creative forces of possibility, a propensity of life. And he extends the divine properties of both imagination and creativity, marking the devotee as an agent. That wonder doesn't just strike you, but you strategically seek wonder. He creates the conditions in which wonder is made possible. So pursuit of wonder, a practice of wonder, becomes far more important in this case. And here, when I asked him, what are you doing? Quite simply, he said, what I'm doing, what technology is, what I'm doing is technology, yes. But what I'm doing is I am invoking Brahman, the supreme deity. Now, Brahman is this cosmological deity from which all things flow. And he's referring to the radical meaning of Brahman. In Sanskrit, root word means to grow, to expand. The concept of Brahman has wrongly been imagined as a sort of singular divinity. But in point of fact, it is about world impermanence. It is the idea of the continuity of change. So ritual specialists like Kashi play a double game, right? They reference things that we know very well, which may not in fact be really new, but they put it in a new context. And in that new context, it becomes the force of wonder. And this is what Greenblatt has talked about in resonance, I think. So Catherine Bell says this resonance is at the heart of ritual. It is the domestication of strange forces. It makes the strange familiar, the familiar strange. Here, lived experience becomes blurred. And the practice of wonder is, I believe, about this blurring. That is what elevates you into a state of worshipful astonishment. I'm going to come to Wittgenstein. So those of you who are thinking about Wittgenstein, hold the thought. So in thinking about this, another illustration is useful. These are all the devotees who came to see the animatronic Devi. And it changes the biometrics of divinity. As you can see, here is Ganesha taking a selfie with his divine family. And here is the Ganesha deity dressed as a software engineer. You can see the lanyards. This was for school and around the time of exams and entries for engineering school, medical school, etc., the deity takes on this cast. So the deity becomes a familiar figure, rather like Greek and Roman deities, a familiar, human-like figure who takes on the troubles of our everyday, but transcends them, most importantly. Yeah? Okay. The second illustration might be useful. So Kashi comes to me and he says he wants to install a shrine to this deity, the Devi deity. And he wanted a helicopter to shower the temple, this new shrine, with holy consecrated water and rose petals for the installation festival. And he says the civil aviation charges are around 60,000 rupees, then about $1,500. He asks me, do you think the price is reasonable? I point out I don't have much experience with hiring private helicopters. It sounds reasonable to me. The morning of the consecration ceremony, I arrive at the Ganesha temple at 4 a.m. and I find Dandu, a neophyte priest, giggling with excitement, sporting a gigantic crash helmet with a radio receiver. One of the young priests slaps him on the back and says, "Ye no Top Gun ready na? Well, Top Gun, are you ready?" Referencing the popular Hollywood movie starring Tom Cruise. I saw Dandu then depart on his scooter with his friends, his dhoti flying to the helicopter takeoff site. At 10 a.m. precisely, the Mahabhishekam, the consecration bath of the deity, where the deity is given life, was over. And the chanting of 108 priests reached a crescendo. Suddenly, we heard a buzzing sound. The 108 priests stopped dead and looked at the sky because we had all heard there would be a helicopter, but nothing. So we waited. Suddenly, from behind the temple tower rose the dark shadow of the helicopter, rising deliberately, almost menacingly, like a scene in an apocalyptic Hollywood movie. But as we watched, rising also with the helicopter, was a lone Garuda, an eagle, a Brahmani kite, the mythic vehicle of Vishnu. The bird clearly had been disturbed from its nest in the temple tree by the noise. Kashi the priest became incoherent in his excitement, and forgetting the magnifying effects of microphone, he shouted, "Helicopter is come! Helicopter! Garuda is here! Helicopter, Garuda! Helicopter, Garuda! Garuda, helicopter!" The assembled crowd of devotees roared, "Garuda helicopter," and folded their hands in prayer. Mr. Sampath, the retired engineer at the Hindustan Aeronautics Laboratory, where he had built satellite communications, repeated Garuda helicopter and then added Vishnu Vahanam, the Vishnu's vehicle, as the helicopter hovered in the clear blue sky. We were all drenched in red and yellow petals, and consecrated holy water as Dandu, who was peering anxiously over the edge of the helicopter, finally found his mark. Many of the devotees were moved and had tears streaming down their faces. I was embarrassed to say I did too. Mr. Sampath and his friend Mr. Iyer said, "Adbhutavagide." It is a wonderful sight. I found myself moved to tears as well. Now, one might argue that such improvisation, the use of non-new technologies in new contexts, is a sort of practicality attendant to piety. That's what Michael Hertzfeld has so persuasively argued. But, and he argued this just last year, and I was so taken with it, but I want to suggest that something more is happening here. The priest when I looked at my notes over 16 years, I found the word wonderment or its cognates 2,000 times. So something else is happening, and it forces us to take not only what the priests are doing seriously, but what they say they are doing seriously as well. And in subsequent days and even years, I heard devotees talk about this ceremony as helicopter adbhuta, the astonishment of the helicopter. Adbhuta, loosely translated, means odd in Sanskrit, but it also is wonder, astonishment, and awe. So what Kashi was doing was he was creating a hybrid between the technological and the marvelous, a conjoined material one, an imagined mythic bird that spoke of both newer technologies, newish technologies, and ancient myth. It was the sudden conflation, this mythic disorientation, that was Adbhuta. It is a sublime vision that conjoins reason and passion, which have been separated in Western understandings, right? And it puts us in a contingent state that is highly valuable. It's an excited contingent state. Helicopters become valued not only as status symbols, but as representing divine transport. So one part of my thinking in this book is going to be about tedium and mundanity and how wonder breaks through tedium and recrafts things. Now, of course, one could and should argue that not every time that the helicopter appears does the Garuda appear, right? It was essentially an act of God. It's unpredictable. The intersection was marvelous. But Kashi said that he was purposely using the helicopter to create a moment when wonderment might make its appearance. So again, the pursuit of wonder versus its actual application. And for believers, perhaps this is wondrous, right? Wonder is a creation of this sublime aesthetic moment, both as a new category of experience and as a subversion of previously understood texts, previously understood relationships and texts. So Pewitt tells us that these wonder, ritual that is creative, pushes us towards a subjunctive state. And I agree, right? So practices of wonder push us to consider the future and futurities and how we imagine these futurities. This potentiality, this world as pregnant in becoming, is a key to understanding the durability of ritual. This is why ritual makes sense. This is what ritual is. It gives us the fuel to imagine possibility. In a world that is constantly engaging the new, from making anew, renewing, and encountering the new. So it folds all that together and creates possibilities and imaginations of the future, the possibility to imagine the future. This, I believe, is what Bergson calls the élan vital, or the propulsive life towards a future. Michael Fisher, down the road at MIT, says technology marks a kind of messianic space, and I think that this is exactly what Kashi is doing, and he's using it as a heightened experimental regime. Now, I know for the scientists here, experimentation would imply failure, and in the rest of the book, I do have examples of when the wonder fails, pursuit of wonder fails spectacularly, and it becomes just mundane. And so there is a sort of pushing and trying newer and newer things, right? So the larger acceptance of what is improvisational marks the temple space as a space of constant experimentation. This experimental regime, combined with the idea that the public imagination, the Hindu imagination, here, Hinduism is the dominant religion. It's complex, but it's also provisional. So residents can be taken by emotions, but they can also imagine a future. They can incorporate helicopters, new forms of money like credit cards into the temple and into their lives without feeling the anxiety of leaving something behind. So rather than the disenchantment of modernity, which Peter Berger has talked about and people after him have worked on, I would argue that this form of modernity doubles down on enchantment. Okay. And now, yep, it's become everyday wonderment. And to my last example. But wonderment came to my life most vividly a week ago. My mother needed a pacemaker. And I called Kashi, and this was my first time I actually used him as a priest to do a personal worship puja for her well-being. He recommended a Vedic fire sacrifice that was a mrityunjaya, a defeat of death. As we went through the details of my vow and my mother's lineage descent and an astrological chart, which is what he needed, Kashi asked me an aside. He suddenly said, "Do you have MacBook Skype?" in English. And I said, "No." So he said, FaceTime. I said, "Yes." Then he says, "Okay, live relay." All in English, by the way. Then he switches to Tamil. "Your mother can see the puja. I'll give you a missed call." This is a South Asian thing of where he calls you and then he doesn't pay for the call and then you see the number and then you call him back, right? Missed call. So traditionally, darshan is when you are face to face with the god, as I said. You see the god sees you, the camphor flame moves between the two. Yeah? So this is classic, people waiting for darshan in the temple. This is darshan. Everyone leaning in to see the god at the moment when the camphor flame is offered. And more importantly, the god looks at you, right? So now we get to this. Your mother can get darshan. The next evening, we FaceTime Kashi on his iPhone after his missed call prompt, at the auspicious start time of the ritual. Over FaceTime, he showed us the entire scene in Bangalore. The monsoon rains had left the temple courtyard wet. The sun just had risen behind the ficus tree where we had seen the Garuda, and the koel birds were whooping and whistling in the branches above. He began the sankalpa, the slow unfurling of ritual intent, with the instructions in English, "Repeat after me," to my mother. Kashi recited the Sanskrit shlokas and mantras, and my mother, seated on a sofa in the Boston night, repeated them. We watched late into the night as priests recited the sacred mantras, the rites of gods and planets, the invocation of planetary gods into their lives, their ritual adoration and sacrifice. We watched as Kashi and his cohort of priests lit a Vedic fire, ringed it with grass, and offered its sacrifices for my mother's life and health. And I don't know, well, let me see. I have a video which is going to be quite loud, but I think you can see the Vedic fire here. So this is a very ancient ritual, and you would have heard the word Rukmini, which is my mother's name, and you would have heard he's essentially battling death on her behalf. Yeah? And then he finishes that, and then he offers us the camphor flame. Watch this. He brings it to the phone. And my mother takes darshan. Okay, so this is 10,600 miles away. Occasionally during the ritual, the internet would cut out, the signals dying as they passed through fiber optic cables deep under the ocean floor. Kashi would disappear while that slowly spinning circle rebuffered. But soon he would reappear stronger than ever and say, "Network okay?" Then once, when the Vedic sacrificial fire flickered low, he gestured to it and said jokingly in Tamil, "Our network is going down. The network of Agni needs more ghee," indicating that his network was one made of smoke that carried the sacrifices to the gods, just as our network that linked us was a virtual one as well. In one reconnect, I happened to place my iPhone, and if we go back, well, maybe you can see the scene. Behind my phone is the DT I had placed for my mother to view. So in one reconnect, I happened to place my iPhone in front of a brightly colored Ganesha image I had placed on my table in Boston. As the phone reconnected, we saw, for that instant, we saw Kashi's puzzled face as he looked directly at the face of the god just before he went live. He came in chuckling, "Oh, look, my boss is now in America." Super. He referred to this network repeatedly, and when I reminded him of what he said about Brahman, he said, "Exactly, that is what I meant." So essentially, I was left with this question. It's wonderful and amusing, and it draws you in. But what are the ethics of this kind of hack? What is actually happening here? What are the morals of improvisation, right? Because I think creativity, we all laud creativity. It's important. We all want to be leaders. Every university tells us that they're going to train us in creativity. Yes. But what does that mean? In South Asia, Pandian and Ali have considered ethical life, and they say the ethical choices are indelibly conjoined with the problems of mundane living in South Asia. But it would appear to me that people like Kashi and the pursuit of wonder that they do have some unforeseen outcomes, where such injunctions are routinely broken or transcended and models are continuously eroded. So creative ethics is each point along this unpredictable trajectory. So I came up with this. I don't like the term creative ethics, and I seek a better term from you all, but that's the best I could come up with. It's each point along this trajectory as a sediment of repeated actions that are special to devotees and priests themselves are performed, and they shift ever so slightly over time. They create a languid volatility of growth and a shift in the ethical paradigm that is almost untraceable. It happens, but one is not cognizant of it happening at the moment that it's happening. The creative ethical paradigm is thus constantly shifting, refining, and extending to reach a final form. I don't know if I should do this, but very quickly, dharma is a word that's used in Hindu philosophy repeatedly, and it is used as a sort of rigid call to duty. Dharma is translated as duty. But here, it becomes a fluid ethical analytic that the devotees and priests use very differentially. It becomes a space of vulnerability where duty is ceded, duty is used, not even be dutiful. So they're translating in a very loose way. So perhaps the good life is not so good or not so moral after all. Untangling the unethical and ethical becomes very difficult at the moment of improvisation. Creativity can be rooted in violence, we know, in disruption, in failure of that which is familiar and stable, and it results in inevitable moral dilemmas that are unresolvable. But it allows us to approach a limit condition to create new imaginations. We open up the world to creative formulations and reformations, allowing for experiences that are alive, creative, life-affirming, radical, and perhaps even freeing. In conclusion, I confess I've been struggling how to write this. You see, it's not easy. Wonder is such an evanescent condition. I think I will write as an experimental folio where the sense of creative play and interrogation and the joy that the priests have should come out, I believe, rather than a textual treatise that moves us towards closure. So I think the fragments of creative acts that I present give us some sense of what is going on in Bangalore. I take heart in Rainier Maria Rilke's statement that most questions are unanswerable when asked. One has to live out the answers. In keeping with that modality, I write what I know, but I try to write through to what I don't know. And I invite openings in the joints between wonder and creativity. For after all, Frederick Barth said one thing with regard to anthropologists. He said studying change is urgent and central to the anthropological endeavor. We need new concepts that allow us to observe and describe events of change. So we have understood change only as disruption, and I have focused on this disruption. But in these spaces, in these interruptions, priests like Kashi not only are informed by the zeitgeist, they push it forward and inform the categories of universal and particular in very specific ways. And they make us think about universal, particular, contemporary, comparative, these sort of structures that are very foundational to interrogations of knowledge. Thank you.